Hey, I'm Noor. I'm a bookseller at Lighthouse and I also work as a translator. I really enjoy reading books about human rights, migration, anti-racism, obviously feminism and politics. So here are some of the books that I really enjoy. Um, Nonfiction. So we're going to start with a few books on migrant rights and refugees. The first is Hostile Environment by Maya Goodfellow. We're in a kind of situation where I think we're having to come to terms with the history of this country, the history of migration, its place here, our place here as people, but also what our future could possibly be. And I think a vital part of that is understanding how deeply anti-migrant we are as a country and how that is enshrined in policy and in law. And Maya's book really, really helped me to understand that history. It's not just one party, it is several, it is all of them that have used migrants as scapegoats. And we should be aware of that, we should fight against that. But more than that, Maya's isn't just like a tale of woe. It is a tale of resistance, of people fighting for their rights and their place here. And we can really take a lot of inspiration from that. As a twin to that is The Ungrateful Refugee by Dina Nayeri. So Dina fled Iran when she was a young child with her mum and her brother. She then writes this memoir several years later. She's an adult now, and she wrote this kind of to reconcile her own memories of being a refugee as a child and also the current situation of a lot of refugees and asylum seekers across the world, particularly in Western parts of the world. And what she kind of does is she kind of pulls you through a very difficult journey on both her part and the part of other people through kind of the asylum process, through the kind of making and remaking again of your identity. And then the kind of portrayal that people place upon you as, what does it mean if you're a refugee? But often not listening to the person themselves, often placing this hierarchy of someone who has a statement versus someone who doesn't. And so this book, I think, is indispensable. And it's hard. It is sometimes a hard book to read, but she writes so well, and I think it's important to read hard things sometimes. So then we come to the great Angela Davis. She wrote Our Prisons Obsolete. So right now we're talking a lot about Black Lives Matter, about mass incarceration and prison abolition and defunding and abolishing the police. And I think that they can be really big conversations, really hard concepts to get your head around because we're born into a world where it seems like those things are non-negotiable. And I think that with some thought and with some guidance, you can kind of realize that that's not true. We don't need those institutions. They don't work as well as we think that they do. And if we really kind of cared and if we wanted mistakes to not be repeated, I don't think we would continue in this line of putting people in a box for 23 hours a day. This book kind of helps with that. It kind of outlines the reasons that this doesn't work, the history of prisons, in a very small book, which is quite helpful. So yes, please read Angela. Everything that she writes is amazing. She is wonderful. We then come to The Beekeeper of Sinjar, written by Dunya Mikhail. She interviews a man who escaped ISIS as they were invading his town. And he develops a network of connections in order to find women who were stolen, kidnapped, and then more or less enslaved by ISIS. And what he then is able to do is connect Dunya with the stories of these women. They have seen horrors, just the worst of all humanity. They've experienced it, they've lived it, and they've resisted it and escaped it. And I think in this time when we're kind of forgetting a lot of our recent history, or we're forgetting a lot of things that have happened in favor of certain narratives, we could do with remembering the normal, ordinary people who really, really should be remembered for their bravery and for their resistance and for their determination to continue. In complete contrast, we have Braiding Sweetgrass. So this is a contrast because it's a very, as much as it is it deals with a lot of sad history of the oppression of and genocide of Native American peoples. It really does kind of outline a very forward-looking and compassionate approach to the way that we can work with the environment to make things better. So it was written by plant scientist Robin Wall Kimmerer. She is a Potawatomi natural scientist, or plant scientist rather. And she writes about the way that her Native American heritage works with her very kind of scientific, rational kind of job in order to kind of look at the way that the world has formed, or at least our environment now is, the history behind that, the kind of exploitation, the disregard for humans and their ways of life, and the state that that's kind of left us in. But then she looks at it as a way to kind of say, okay, this has happened, but what do we do now? And in that, I found it really constructive because it helps you to find this connection to land, even if you're not a very nature-ish person yourself, but you can then move forward. You can say, okay, this is needed. And she writes in such a beautiful, lyrical, poetic way that I don't think you really could not be connected to the land after you've read this. And then finally, from my nonfiction recommends, we have a memoir by Samra Habib called We Have Always Been Here. So Samra is a queer Muslim, I think Pakistani Canadian writer and photographer. And this is her memoir of kind of becoming who she is now, of kind of her difficult kind of journey, learning about her identities as a person, but also kind of embracing them, following them, going through this journey of people accepting her and people not accepting her, of them dismissing her, and then her drive to kind of find herself anyway. And it ends with something that I found quite inspiring. She photographed lots of people who inspired her and whose politics aligned with hers and who she had learnt from, which I think is a pretty amazing way to honor those people in your life. Yeah, so please check this out. It's quite well written, and I appreciate that she wrote so honestly about her own life. I think it's quite inspiring. So those are my nonfiction recommends. Thanks for listening, and if you want any more, I'm at the Lighthouse.